Hello ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining me in my attempt to create a World War II inspired Chaos Space Marine Predator. Now I know what you may be thinking, saying Predator this early into a video will probably get me demonetized on YouTube, but I haven't said paedophile, so it's absolutely fine. Oh bugger. Well, never mind, because I'm not monetized anyway. As you can see from this classic Predator, I have quite a bit of competition, and I'm not going to waste your time, so let's get straight into it. I started by cutting off the edges of the top panel. As many of you may be aware, Warhammer vehicles are nothing like their real-world counterparts in many ways, particularly their dimensions and general shape. They're normally much higher and thicker. This necessitated me to have to make significant changes to the shell of the body. Now I would be a hypocrite to complain about thickness, and I wouldn't normally do so. But in this situation, I thought that it was very important to actually meaningfully attempt a World War II outline. So I sympathetically took apart the bits of the tank that most interested me, and then proceeded with the real heavy-duty stuff, chewing up the sides so that it was fully cut down as shown. This early on into the project, I intentionally avoided cutting the pegs, purely for the sake of structural rigidity. Another factor was that I didn't want to have to redo them in the event that they were needed, for as many of my ex-partners know, pegging is not my forte. With the bulk of the material now dealt with, I had all these jagged edges I wanted to get rid of, for obvious reasons. The most expedient way of doing so, I found, was to level off the entirety of the top on a sheet of sandpaper. With there now being no exhausts on the sides, and the fact that no World War II vehicles had side-mounted exhausts anyway, I think, I grabbed the back end of this scrapped Land Raider, and proceeded to rip and tear so that I could force it into the bottom. This mostly involved removing the section at the back of the tracks, as shown here, as well as the lower part of the panel making up the exhaust section. This took quite a bit of perseverance, but not unlike the hookers in my basement, it gave way eventually. Full disclosure, I did have to scrape down the sides a tad, but as you can see it fits quite nicely now. I also added a little extension to the lower part of the hull. That'll come in handy later. In my mind, I was thinking of designing something akin to a Jagdtiger. Now that the exhausts were in place, I could better visualise how I wanted the armour to slope in relation to the back of the vehicle, which understandably meant more cutting and sanding was in order. While I was in the process of doing that, I decided that one of the internal doors would be very well served for a future part of the project, which meant I had to crack out my trusty Dremel, which is totally mine and not stolen from my father, despite his protestations to the contrary. With the door now removed and in hand, I decided to test fit a few pieces of armour panel that I intended to put on the sides. Unfortunately, I only had 2 of the long pieces, and as you can see I would need more to cover the length of the chassis. So I had the brilliant idea of cutting it in half. This does not work with all things, unfortunately. For example, the old wives' tale that cutting worms in half makes 2 of them is completely false, and all you'll have done is killed a single worm. It was a rare tank of the era that didn't have quite aggressively sloped front armour. The reason for this is because it helps with round deflection. It also meant that you would need less thick armour to have the same relative level of protection for the crew inside. As I was test fitting the side armour, I realised that the internal doors would have actually been in the way in the first place, so I removed the other one too, albeit less carefully. This seemed as good a time as any to fit the hatches back onto the tank, now that I had a much better idea of where the armour panels were going to sit. At this stage I was using pieces of paper as there was no sense in wasting good plasticard. In editing I noticed that I had forgotten to turn on the ring light. Normally I don't forget a good ring. My unreserved apologies to you, dear viewer. With the plasticard now cut from the templates, I put a few notches into relevant areas so that they could better support themselves when assembled. Now that I had the front panel to my liking, I used it as a guide to cut the rear piece out of the plasticard sheet. I tend not to worry about cutting all the way through, as plasticard snaps very easily once you've been able to get the initial line. I again used the same sheet of plasticard to cut the notches with the rotary tool in identical locations. While I had the rotary tool out, I used it to make an initial hole so that I could scrape out the remainder of the hatch that I didn't want, as I needed to put a Space Marine there. Well, I didn't need to, but very much like your mother, I like my holes with men in them.
Ha! Gay!
With that out of the way, I put the front of the hull on. With the armour now in place, I could use it as a guide to mock up the front angled panels. For this, I used another piece of paper offcut. Normally I'd recommend gluing the paper template onto the plasticard with PVA and then cutting it, but I'm simply impatient. As the panel didn't really have anything to grab onto inside the hull, I mixed up a bit of green stuff so that it had something to stick to the side with, mirroring that on the opposite side of the body. With those panels now sorted, I could put on those strips of armour that I cut earlier. I used thin bits of plasticard to raise them up and then secured them with green stuff. Nice and easy. The way women should be. The main panels of the tank were coming along quite nicely at this point. There wasn't much left of the main frame of the vehicle left to do, apart from the roof, as demonstrated, and I glued it at the right height to use some tactical leftovers. I decided that it would look nicer if I used this diamond plate to fill in the recesses in the armour. Same deal with paper templates and cutting the plasticard. You've seen plenty of plasticard by now. On the subject of plasticard, I cut a small piece so that I could do the rear shelf. This could then be decorated with the door that I cut out earlier. I then selected this door component as it bore a striking resemblance to the rear door on the back of a Jagdtiger. Going back to the rear shelf, that door is to emulate an access panel for the engine, but every engine needs cooling vents, so I picked out this part and cut it so that two of the radiator grills could be used either side of the door. I also added the last bits of the armour from the upgrade sprue for the Imperial Guard, thereby filling out the rear section quite nicely. It was then time to commence work on the roof hatch. The ring for the hatch was secured with a liberal application of green stuff, quite a bit thicker than I'd normally go for, just so that it could build the height and ensure that it is level with the top of the tank. I then forced a generous amount of green stuff around the edges to make sure that the roof wouldn't fall in for the next step. It was at this point where I thought of a good use for the bits of the tank that I cut off at the beginning of the video. After cutting off these sloped bits, I was left with a decent piece that had a few little details on there that would just be easier than cutting it out of plasticard. Truth be told, I was getting pretty sick of plasticard at this point. To be able to add these panels on, there was a large void in the body that needed to be filled. Once again, green stuff comes to the rescue, and a huge blob of that will sort out most of your problems when it comes to filling in gaps. Disappointingly, I'd already made a joke about your mother earlier in the video, so I'm just going to have to let that setup lie. As you can see at this point, I'm gripping a rod, but don't worry, it does have a function. I'm going to be turning it into the main cannon. But unlike the rod I'm normally gripping, this one's unfortunately too long. The Dremel fixed that no problem though. I also thought it'd be cool to add this muzzle brake from a toy Tiger. Now, for those who know a lot about World War II tanks, most Jagdtigers didn't actually have muzzle brakes, but there were a few, and one of them did see combat, so I'm letting it pass. I mean, admittedly it ran out of fuel and was turned into a roadblock, but still. But anyway, let's get back on topic. As the sponson mounts and the top were now missing because of all the destruction that I'd done to the side of the tank, I had to get a little creative. I thought it would look really cool to use these circular hatches instead. With a little bit of cutting and sanding, they were ready to go. It was now time to crack out the milliput. Milliput is different to green stuff. Green stuff is more like unhardened bubblegum. Milliput is more like a kind of fine modelling clay. Due to this difference, however, it spreads much better, and you can get a really consistent, smooth, flat surface if you use the right tools. What I am using are silicone colour shapers. You can find them in quite a few art stores. What I'm doing here is adding a texture to make it look like Zimmer coating. Zimmer coating was intended to stop magnetic mines, that the Allies didn't use. Trust the Germans to fix a problem that doesn't exist. These beads in the threaded screw are for the turret mounting. The beads aren't for decoration, but to try and fill out the gaps. The plasticard underneath is so that you've got something to rub the tool against, so you get a nice clean edge. Personally, I think it looks pretty damn sweet. And now for the long dark winter of my discontent. I made the stupid decision to create Warframen. This was a truly arduous and fiddly process. Endlessly frustrating. I do not recommend you guys try this if you genuinely like yourself. Luckily, I don't have that inconvenience. And let's be honest, if you're still watching this video at this point, you're statistically, guys, you should see my metrics. I recommend for your own sanity that you make little sub-assemblies and frames so that you can put this together a little bit easier. Trying to do it from scratch will drive you mental. I already made that mistake. Once you have a collection of these little contraptions made out of iframes and corrugated plasticard, you can squeeze them together with a little bit of green stuff, roughly forming a box that you can then tidy up. It's at this point that if you're gentle, you can push munitions into it. I do not recommend trying to put green stuff around the munitions and then making a box. I also made that mistake. These munitions come from fake Lego. You can then secure the top and bottom with little boxes. I think the end result is pretty good, but honestly, if you're going to try this, I wish you the best of luck. Please take care. It's now time to crack out my trusty friend, the Green Stuff World Tentacle/Cable Roller. Don't forget to get it nice and wet or you are going to have a hell of a mess on your hands. Now I know, it may be hard to believe that I get things wet and then end up with messy hands as a result, but in this specific instance I do know what I'm talking about. I really like the cables that come out of these rollers. A way to really set them off is to use pieces of plastic card and connect them to that so it's got a connection point as opposed to just going directly into a piece of armour plating. Give the cables about an hour or so to harden so you don't cause damage to them moving them around, and then secure them in place with a little daub of super glue. With the back of the tank completely to my liking, I secure the exhaust with a bit of plastic glue and we're all good back there. We're now firmly into the tidying up and finishing stage of the build. I went around the tank and filled up any gaps and cracks that were a little unsightly with milliput. After it had an opportunity to dry, I then scraped off any excess with a toothpick. If you really can't remove it, a metal tool will suffice, but I prefer using a toothpick on the grounds that it's less likely to leave scratches. With the majority of that done, I secured the sponson mounts with a little bit of green stuff. Any excess can be sliced away. The hole mounted bolter was covered in a small amount of milliput, which was then given the Zimmer coating treatment. I really wanted to look like a Jagdtiger from the front. Remember the extension to the lower hull? Now it's time to put in the glacis plate. Another thing I added to the front was this frame from an Imperial Guard mortar. With a little bit of modification, it will make it look even more like a Jagdtiger, hopefully. Seeing as the turret was on a screw thread and removable, I thought I might as well make the sponsons removable too. This was a simple matter of filling in the gaps and putting in holes for the magnets. I don't generally magnetise things as I have enough animal magnetism as it is, but they can certainly be convenient. Something I'd highly recommend doing when using magnets is to mark the side that you don't want to be touching the magnet. That way you don't glue it the wrong way up. And like that, it's a snap. I'm sorry, that was awful. We are now in the final stage where we get to add the crew and accessories. To harvest the smoke launchers from this Predator turret, I softened the bond with some plastic glue and seesawed it off with a craft knife. If I remember correctly, most of the accessories that I'll be adding come respectively from the Imperial Guard upgrade sprue and the Chaos upgrade sprue that you get in the Chaos vehicle kits. Sorry to tease you with so little of the accessories, but I do want to leave a little bit for the reveal. The Werframen need a mounting point. In my mind, it had to be something that could conceivably rotate. As a result, I sacrificed 2 Tau drones. Their sacrifice is for the greater good, and sanded off the top of their domes until the centerpiece could be pressed through with a tool. It was then a simple matter of using plastic glue to add it to the rear of the tank's body. I then filled the center point with green stuff, attached the Warframen to a square piece of plasticard, and pressed it in. At this point I was pretty much done, but I really wanted the commander to stand out, so I thought I'd give him a hand job. No, wait. How do I say this? I gave him a bit of wrist action. No, wait. I gave him an open hand so that he can grip something firmly. There we go. And now, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to present you with the Jagdpredhummel? Oh, actually, that could sound pretty good. The Jagdpredhummel!
What is it, girl? Hey? What is it? You a good girl? Oh, good girl, yes. Oh, you want to go wee wee? Oh, okay, let's go wee wee.